Ask and ye shall receive. Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a tabletop game designer, a history lover, and a lifetime player of Age of Empires 2. And on this installment of Theory Crafting, where we take a look at civs and units not yet present in Age of Empires 2, and I take my best crack at making a design for them that could fit well into the game, we are taking a look at my single most requested build yet. Something that I mentioned in passing during my Jurchens build, link up here if you want to take a look at that. That then set off a clamor in the comments section, and who am I to say no to people asking so nicely? And so now, without further ado, I present to you the hunting dog. This unit will serve a niche that I don't think any other unit in-game has yet occupied, and does so in a way that I think you'll find quite interesting. As always, you can find a link down in the description to a unit document containing all the specific numbers for this build, all of the stats, everything that I won't necessarily have time to get into during this presentation. And if you'd like any disclaimers on this build or an overview of my philosophy as a game designer approaching theory crafting, take a look on the screen right now. Let's get into the history. So, dogs and man have long been intertwined through the powerful bonds of pack hierarchy commandeered by domestication. It's no secret that dogs have been domesticated pretty much worldwide for something like 25,000 years, and the AoE2 relevant time frame was no exception whatsoever. Literally every civilization that currently exists in Age of Empires 2 had some sort of canine presence in their cultures. Yes, even the Mesoamerican civilizations. And while there isn't 100% conclusive evidence that all of these cultures use dogs in hunting, it is, as we say, a fairly safe bet. Additionally, while warhounds were more commonly used during ancient times, they were still a presence during the AoE2 relevant time frame in a great many different cultures. That being said, while definitely more pervasive than you might at first expect, dogs were not necessarily a weapon of mass destruction. They are certainly threatening, and when used as shock troops can definitely take especially unprepared soldiers very much off guard and do some serious damage, but they were more effectively used for terror. Used to rout enemies rather than kill them, used to control civilian populations, used to threaten and intimidate, as well as guard locations. And so, as such, warhounds were not the backbone of any medieval army, instead serving a variety of utility roles that still were useful enough to make them a fairly common presence on medieval battlefields writ large. In fact, a number of warhounds were even armored by medieval societies, in everything from padded coats to full metal suits, though the latter was certainly not common and quite possibly just for show. But at the very least, there is precedent for doggo armor, meaning that these little guys were expected to see at least some amount of vanguard action in a number of different locations around the world. So there were a number of civilizations which made pretty extensive use of warhounds and hunting dogs during the AoE2 relevant time frame. Well, pretty much all the civilizations used hunting dogs as mentioned, but in terms of warhounds and the ones that really delved deep into dog-based combat, the Jurchens are an obvious first pick. As mentioned in my build for the Jurchens, they treated dogs with immense respect and held them to a far higher level of dignity and living standards than just about any other medieval culture. In fact, they were so good to their dogs that local Chinese Ming officials and diplomats who visited them, whose culture tended to see dogs as being relatively inferior beings, thought that the Jurchens were absolutely disgusting and bizarre for keeping such close company with them. But the Jurchens made good use of their dogs in both hunting and in war. Another example are the Celts, specifically the Irish and Scottish. These cultures used warhounds since antiquity, but even into the AoE2 relevant time frame, the Irish Celts made use of the famous Irish wolfhound in war on many occasions. One wrangler sometimes controlling up to 6 or even 8 dogs on the battlefield at a time. The Irish wolfhound is today one of the largest dog breeds that is publicly available, and a big part of this is because they needed to be big enough to knock men to the ground and rip their throats out, not to mention fighting off wolves, which they were very, very capable of doing. And lastly, the Spanish made extensive use of dogs during various points across history. Towards the beginning of the AoE2 relevant time frame, the Spanish inherited a dog-rearing tradition from the Gothic peoples who settled the Iberian Peninsula. And this canine tradition carried well into the 1500s AD and was a fixture of conquistador-era Mexico, where highly trained and powerful war mastiffs were a key part in the subjugation of the various Mexican peoples, who did, I might remind you, also have dogs of their own, but none of whom were as big, powerful, well-trained, or well-bred for killing as the Spanish Mastiffs were. And so, with this history and context, I went into this build of the hunting dog with a couple specific goals in mind. The first of which is I wanted to make the Dark Age more interesting. Now, I don't know how many people would agree with me that the Dark Age should be more interesting, but it is my personal opinion that Dark Age gameplay in Age of Empires 2 is a little bit too streamlined. And so with the hunting dog, my hope was to have an early unit that would help with economy, but also have some other utility elements that could allow Dark Age to play out in a couple of different ways than the standard hyper-optimized build orders and drushes that we are used to now. I also thought it would be nice to have the hunting dog allow newer players a little bit of help in some of the tricky micro that it takes to optimize the Dark Age, especially in terms of deer pushing and stuff like that. But that doesn't mean that advanced players would get no use out of the unit. Instead, I think that this build of the hunting dog should allow expert players to actually have a higher skill ceiling in what they can do in the Dark Age, making use of the hunting dog in a way that a newer player probably couldn't to further optimize their starts. Now, the hunting dog does have some opportunity costs. I didn't want it to just be another piece in the hyper-streamlined Dark Age that we see now, so I think there will be plenty of games that you don't want to get them. But ideally, I wanted there to be at least some circumstances where you did want to get them. So that was another of the major goals that I was focusing on, as well as the fact that this hunting dog build shouldn't just be useless after Dark and Feudal Age, especially if you're playing a Civ that gets the Warhound upgrade. When you do upgrade it into the Warhound, you are rewarded with this very interesting micro-intensive harassing unit that's very, very easy to tech into, extremely cheap, and really effective in like small group combat like you tend to see in early Castle Age. However, I didn't want it to just be an economy raiding unit. So not only is the Warhound not very good against enemy eco in comparison to other raiding units, but it's also extremely counterable. Like, they can take down a lot of stuff in small groups, but once armies start to get bigger and more massed up, the Warhound will have a lot more of an issue cracking through, which seems pretty much perfect to me. A unit that can't really be the backbone of your army, but has a lot of useful utility and offers kind of a fast-paced, micro-intensive approach to Castle Age gameplay if you want to take the risk and go that route. So with that, we come to the end of the history and introduction section for the hunting dog. If this was all you were here for, thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. And for everyone else, let's get into the game mechanics. How would my hunting dog unit actually work in the context of Age of Empires 2? Let's begin with an overview. To start with, the hunting dog is available from Dark Age at your town center. This does mean you are taking a valuable TC time in order to produce one, though they are quicker and cheaper to produce than a villager. In the Castle Age, you can upgrade them to Warhounds. This upgrade is not cheap for a Castle Age upgrade, but it does allow the Warhound to be trainable at the barracks in addition to the town center, making it much easier to spam and not nearly as draining on your economy to go into. For an overview of the hunting dog stats, they are very cheap at only 25 food, and they have vaguely villager-like stats, except they are a good deal faster. They also have a special ability, much like the Hunting Wolf does in-game now, where when you task them to attack something, they get a 50% speed boost, making them by far and away the fastest unit pre-Castle Age when they are on the offense. They also have a bonus versus wolves, but are weak to spears and villagers, meaning that it's a lot harder for them to get into the enemy economy and wreak havoc like you might want or expect a fast early unit to do. So instead, they're much better suited to helping out with your eco early on, as well as dealing with kind of Dark Age and Feudal Age skirmishes. Lastly, the hunting dog has a unique ability where if you task it towards a huntable, it will attack the huntable, doing no damage, and instead driving the huntable away in a straight line as it runs away from the dog. This means that if you position your dog right behind a huntable unit and just task it to attack once, it will chase that unit in a straight line pretty much all the way back to your town center, saving you a whole lot of headache with using your scout or a villager to push or lure deer or boar. There is no limit to how far a hunting dog can push a wild animal, meaning that it also can be used to try to do some laming if you go all the way across the map, but at that point, you'll have to do a little more micro to help navigate the wild animal around obstacles that might get in its way. Additionally, the hunting dog does gain bonus line of sight as you age up, starting off substantially worse than a scout cavalry, but by Imperial age, it can see extremely far as many ranged units. Now, once you upgrade the hunting dog to the Warhound, you get some nice stat bonuses. Its pretty pathetic damage that it has by base will upgrade to fairly threatening levels, though still it will comfortably lose to something like a longswordsman in Castle Age. It also gets a little bit more HP and armor, though not more HP than something like an elite skirmisher would have, putting it firmly in the glass cannon category. It does, however, get a Shrivamsh Rider-like dodge shield, allowing it to dodge 2 attacks of any variety over I think a 15-second window. This means that a Warhound, especially 1 versus 1, can be really threatening to some units, and versus units that have a minimum range, it can stay on top of them without taking any damage at all. However, its low health means that once that dodge shield is broken, it will crumple within seconds, especially to something like spears that have bonus damage, or units with very high base damage like swordsmen and knights. Additionally, while its stats are fairly respectable, especially its damage stats for Castle Age, it doesn't get any smith upgrades, meaning that it will quickly fall off once late castle and early imperial hits and everything is getting such high armor and attack that the Warhound can't really keep up. It will probably still have some utility after that point, and even with villagers dealing bonus damage to it, it can still be a pretty effective economy raider, but once you start to hit your post-imperial army comp, the Warhound, despite its low cost, will probably not have a good place within your strategy. As mentioned previously, if you want any more details on any of the stats, I have all of them in full in the description down below. So in terms of specific technologies, I did design one technology with the hunting dog explicitly in mind, that being a Dark Age technology called Hunting Horn. Now, this is researched at the town center. It has the same research time as Loom. And of course, since you start with 100 gold, you should be able to pick up both of these techs with your starting resources if you wish to do so. Hunting Horn makes it such that your villagers will deal 2 more damage to animals of all kinds. Your hunters will work a little bit faster, which could help out a lot with things like early deer and boar. And your dogs get plus 25% speed, meaning that even without running, they'll be able to outspeed Dark Age scout units, and with running, they become some of the fastest units in the game. And so while Hunting Horn is primarily going to help you out in Dark Age for your hunting economy, it will have implications through the rest of the game if you intend to use Warhounds for harassing and flanking during late Castle and Imperial. My hope with this technology is that it is not automatically the thing that you need to get, and that you can kind of tech into it if you think your situation is appropriate. If you're making use of hunting dogs, you might not even need to get Loom, because there's very little chance that your villagers will die to a boar. And more broadly, it will diversify the options for how you can spend your resources during Dark Age, which should add a little bit more nuanced decision making to the first 10 minutes of the game. Now, how do I envision the hunting dog would play overall? Well, without a doubt, their main benefit is going to be in Dark Age hunting. The fact that they can pretty much automatically push things like deer and boar with very little risk should make them a huge help both to newer players and to more advanced ones. With a scout, your deer will always kind of stop for a moment, which gives them a chance to be sent off track or lose interest and go walking back to their starting point. And hunting dogs do not have this stop period when they are chasing an animal, meaning that you should be able to push in your deer very smoothly and with very little risk of screwing up. They also, of course, open up the opportunity for things like boar laming, running a boar all the way across the map from your enemy's base, which could be fun if you can pull it off and would certainly be cool. It is far from without risk, though, because since your hunting dogs are so squishy, your enemy getting a scout cavalry on top of them will really destroy any prospects of the lame working out. Additionally, once you upgrade the hunting dog to the warhound, you have some castle age pressure, almost serving a similar role to something like a cavalry archer. You have like a small control group of these guys that you sprint in and wreak havoc on the enemy economy, or you run in behind something like an enemy mangonel or crossbows in Castle Age. Once everyone starts to get more armor and DPS, the warhound will have trouble keeping up. But especially in the mid-game, massing these guys up from the barracks for very, very cheap food cost should make for a really interesting and I'm hoping pretty viable alternative raiding and skirmishing unit. But as I'm sure you have inferred, the hunting dog and warhound will have a great many weaknesses. For one, even though they are fast and even though they are cheap, they are not great for rushing. Vills will win against them 1 versus 1 in pretty much every context, and spearmen have enough bonus damage to kill them in about 3 hits before any upgrades kick in. And so while you might be able to pull off some tricky Castle Age warhound pressure where their damage and dodge shield should be able to overwhelm a couple of token spearmen or villagers fighting back, you're generally not going to be using your doggos to attack enemy eco anytime before Castle Age. Even beyond the practical issues with it, training a bunch of hunting dogs will eat up your TC's training time. They take about 60% of the time it takes to train a villager, but that is still time you could have been spent training villagers. And as we all know, if you are not producing villagers in Dark Age, you are often losing the game. And so if you do commit to a hunting dog rush, you need to really be sure that you kill multiple enemy villagers in order to make it worth your time. Additionally, though the hunting dog and warhound are very cheap, they really get clapped by just about anything without a minimum range once upgrades start to kick in. And since they only have amazing speed when you're tasking them to attack an enemy, they aren't really that good at hit and run, unlike something like Imperial Age Hussars that get into the back of your economy. Because of this, when you task your warhounds to attack, you kind of need to be willing to lose them. Almost like a petard with more nuance, where they just rush in, rip up everything they can, and then probably die before you can pull them back out of the fray. In addition to their main strengths, however, there are a couple of other things that I see the hunting dog and warhound being useful for. One being, if you, for example, lose your scout and no longer have any other huntables to push, they can be used to scout the map. They have less speed and line of sight than normal Dark Age scouts, but you're still getting some scouting done, and that's better than nothing. If you're on a map like Gold Rush, the hunting dog is also very good at killing predator units, so having one around on maps like that or dingoes could actually be a fairly legitimate strategy to give yourself a little bit more insurance in the early game. And lastly, in late game, as I was mentioning, anything with a minimum range will be absolutely destroyed by the hunting dog. Things like onagers in particular, where they can dodge the onager's shot with their little dodge shield and then get right on top of it, are pretty much the optimal target for warhounds once you hit Imperial Age and onwards. They also don't have any sort of innate weakness versus siege or any reduced damage versus siege, though they do have a hard-coded 1 damage to buildings. And so while you still want them to be solely used on the battlefield rather than raiding or base destruction, they cost absolute pennies in comparison to some of the high-priority siege units that you're often going to be using them to target. So I can see them still having a little bit of utility in those sort of late-game circumstances against specific enemy army compositions. So what civilizations would actually get access to the hunting dog and warhound? Well, as a couple of examples, I have for you the Goths, Huns, and Romans, all 3 of whom would receive the hunting dog, warhound, and the hunting horn unique technology. In the case of the Romans and Huns, I could even see them having a civilization bonus that specifically boosts their dog units, since both of those factions were well known for their use of warhounds during the AoE2 relevant timeframe. Additionally, there are a great many civilizations that have just fine hunting dogs. The Byzantines and Sicilians, for example, don't have hunting horn but do have warhounds, while my civilization, the Mosei, link to them up here if you want to go take a look at my build, as well as the Saracens, would have hunting horn but not warhound at their disposal. Lastly, while there are no civilizations in the game that completely miss the hunting dog, the Bengalis, Italians, Zapotecs, another of my builds, check up here if you want to see them, would only be restricted to the hunting dog unit without any of the unique technologies. Though I do imagine that a lot of civilizations that just have the hunting dog could still make great use of it in Dark and possibly early Feudal Age. That was one of my goals with the builds at the very least. If you are interested in seeing a full availability grid for every single civilization, both official and the ones that I have done in this Theorycraft series, take a look at my unit document down in the description. And now, before we wrap up, let us, as always, take a glance at the loose threads of this build, starting with some uncertainties that weren't quite resolved for me by the time I finished it. For one, I really am not sure whether my build of the hunting dog here would be completely worthless or genuinely meta-defining. My goal is to have it be neither of the above, something that is potentially usable for a variety of strategies, both for new players and pros, without being something that you just have to do every game. It is a personal pet peeve of mine when you have to play a game in a very specific way during a very specific part, no matter what your eventual strategy might be later. And so while one of my stated goals for the hunting dog was to break that particular mold for Age of Empires 2, I have no idea whether I accomplished it in the slightest. That's up to you to decide. And secondly, I'm not sure if my hunting horn technology would ever be worth it. Like, taking up TC time is very important, and the hunter-gather rate bonus, which is kind of the important part of the technology, isn't that impactful as comparison to just making another villager. But I'm hoping that kind of a combination of little utility pieces will be enough that hunting horn actually becomes something that anyone would ever pick up. So those are just a couple of the things that were lingering in my mind from this build, but now let's move on to some tabled ideas. Pieces of the build that I considered at one point, but for one reason or another decided not to go with in the end. For one, I had an idea where the hunting dog and warhound could benefit in part from both bloodlines and husbandry at the stable. Now, both of these things were very important in dog breeding and dog domestication, but at that point, I'm bringing a third building into the mix. You have the town center, which contains them, then they go to the barracks, you have to make them en masse, and then you have the stable to upgrade them. Just felt like too many buildings coming into play. I also, at one point, had the Warhound have an attack bonus versus infantry, and then a little later on, I converted that to an attack bonus versus cavalry, and then at another point, I had them taking less damage from cavalry. Warhounds had a lot of different uses on medieval battlefields, everything from knocking men off of their feet onto the ground to scaring horses. But in the end, I decided that rather than taking all of these different pieces into consideration, giving them a simple damage shield should help convey the idea that if you're fighting a dog one-on-one, you're in trouble. That thing will dodge out of the way of everything you throw at it, knock you to the ground, and try to tear your throat out. But if you have buddies around, it's not very hard to keep the dog off of you. You'll be able to out-damage it far faster than its dodge shield can replenish. And beyond that, I also had an idea where you could train hunting dogs at like the house or the mill instead of the town center. In the end, I decided that the trade-off of town center training time was actually an interesting piece of the equation, and that having them produced from a house or a mill would probably be oppressive or make them kind of an automatic go-to that you would always get. But this is an option I could see myself potentially bending on. Except for the house part. That's just ridiculous, because that will just mean that you can produce like 100 of them at a time if you want. And I don't think anyone wants to face a flood of dogs as they're trying to close out the game. And it didn't really feel correct to the history to have it be so easy to have your hounds block out the sun, so I liked keeping it to the town center and barracks, at least for now. Lastly, I cycled through a bunch of different ideas for my hunting horn technology. Everything from giving villagers and dogs bonus line of sight, to increasing the carry rate of your hunters like the current Goth bonus, to causing animals that you shoot to like freeze in place with fear for a moment, but in the end I decided to go with the slightly more grounded grab bag that you saw in the build a little bit earlier. I'd be happy to change pieces of it though, especially if people thought that there were better ways to refine it down and make it a consideration rather than useless or automatic. But beyond all that, the major question that lingers in my mind is, does this build achieve its intended goal? Does it actually provide the player with more valid but non-mandatory options early game that doesn't lead to completely useless wasted units sitting around in the mid and late game? And that's really up to you guys to decide. I'd love to hear your thoughts, because I think this is like one of the most unconventional units that I could imagine actually making it into the game, and I think that it tables a lot of really interesting questions about how the tempo of an AoE2 game actually does and should play out. But with all that being said, this brings us to the end of this particular unit Theorycraft. Thank you guys so much for watching. Before we sign off though, as always, we're going to take a look at the old likeliniometer. In my opinion, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is it that a unit like the Hunting Dog or Warhound, as I have designed them here, could actually make it into Age of Empires 2 at some point in the future? And today, on the likeliniometer, we have a 1.5 out of 10. I think it's incredibly unlikely that a hunting dog would actually be implemented in-game. I feel like Dark Age options aren't really something that the developers or community at large, besides like me at least, are really that interested in. And I could see it being such a paradigm shifter that it might really throw a lot of people off or make them feel like the game doesn't feel like Age of Empires 2 anymore. But that might be me putting words into other people's mouths. I would personally absolutely love to see a build like this, both because expanding gameplay options are one of the most important things to me as a game designer, but also because it's a dog. It's cool. It lets you do something else besides just people and horses and camels and elephants and stuff like that. And that is fun, my friends. But I'd like to hear what you think of the design. What would you have done differently with the hunting dog? Do you think a hunting dog belongs in the game? Do you think it absolutely has no place being near the game? And what civilization, unit, or topic more broadly would you like me to tackle in the next video? But with all that being said, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.